Congratulations, you've just woken up in the city of Uruk. The year is roughly 2300 BCE. The good news, you're not dead. The bad news, you're extremely single, and people keep trying to marry you off using livestock. You're lying on a thin mat in a mud brick room that smells like old incense, cooked onions, and the inside of a camel's mouth. The walls are sweating. You're sweating. Everyone's sweating. Romance hangs heavy in the air, by which I mean humidity and possibly mould. There's a rat watching you from a ceiling beam. He's also single, but he's not your type. Probably. You groggily sit up and scratch at the bite marks on your ankle, probably from bugs, hopefully not from suitors. Outside, the marketplace is already buzzing with people shouting, goats screaming, and the unmistakable sound of someone trying to negotiate a marriage using 3 jars of barley and a sheep with a limp. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, love wasn't a feeling, it was a contract, a legally binding, clay-inscribed, livestock-backed agreement, one that often began before you were old enough to count to 10. Your marriage could be arranged the moment you were born, based on your family status, your land access, and whether or not your cousin already claimed the good irrigation canal. Romantic, not especially, but highly efficient. Marriage contracts here came with the kind of fine print you'd expect from a shady landlord. Clauses about fertility, infidelity, and even contingency plans if one party fails to perform their duties. And yes, those duties included making heirs. If you couldn't produce a child within 2 years, your spouse was legally allowed to get a second spouse, or a servant, or a ritual goat. It's complicated. If that sounds emotionally exhausting, don't worry. Actual love wasn't entirely off the table, but you were expected to handle it diplomatically, like writing your lover a poem on a clay tablet in cuneiform while everyone watched. You shuffle out into the street and narrowly avoid stepping in someone's offering to the goddess Inanna, or possibly someone's breakfast. Hard to tell. Everything is moist and slightly cursed. A woman nearby is burning herbs and whispering a spell that involves rose petals, crushed beetles, and the name of her crush carved into a piece of pottery. You make a mental note never to reject her. Temple priestesses, especially those devoted to love deities like Inanna or Ishtar, played a major role in relationships. They weren't celibate. In fact, some of them practiced ritual sex with worshippers as a sacred act, believed to bring fertility, prosperity, and the occasional awkward eye contact. It was holy. It was respected. It was weirdly organised. And if things went badly in your love life, you had options. Ancient Mesopotamians had a spell for everything. Want someone to fall in love with you? Bury their sandal in a sacred field and rub date syrup on your eyebrows. Want to end a relationship? Burn a sheep figurine upside down under the full moon while spitting into a clay bowl. If none of this worked, you could always consult a professional, like a priest, a witch, or that one old woman who just knew things, usually wrong things, but confidently wrong. You try to walk through the town square, but a procession of newlyweds blocks your path. They're carrying jugs of beer, chunks of roasted meat, and something that looks suspiciously like a ceremonial loincloth. The crowd is singing, loudly, off-key. One of them winks at you. They're missing most of their teeth. Welcome to Mesopotamian romance. It's loud, it's sweaty, it's legally binding. And if you thought that was strange, just wait until you hear how some lovers tested their compatibility using sheep livers. That's right. Before dating apps, before astrology, before long walks on the beach, there was extispacy, the ancient science of cutting open animals to see if your relationship was destined to fail. But don't worry, we'll get to that in just a moment. Because your date night is about to involve entrails. Now, before you drift off to sleep, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and comment where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Our sleepy history community is growing faster by the second. Now back to the story. You try to sidestep the married couple with the ceremonial loincloth and the goat on a leash, but they're blocking the alley, and the smell of celebratory roast ox is merging poorly with the city's ambient aroma of sweat, ash, and questionable liquids. You take a hard turn into a side path where someone's chanting quietly over a fire. There's a sheep on the ground. It's very still. Its liver is not. This is not a barbecue. This is a love consultation. Mesopotamians practiced something called extispacy. It means reading the entrails of sacrificed animals to predict the future. Today, it's being used to decide whether your romantic relationship will blossom or backfire with catastrophic legal consequences. And because it's considered a science, the priest performing the reading has a whole clay model of a sheep liver for training purposes. That's right, they practiced this. He pokes the liver with a stick and mumbles, "The gallbladder is swollen. That's either a sign of passion or betrayal, or indigestion." Interpretations vary. The priest looks up, makes eye contact with you and nods. You're not in love. You're doomed. Also, you owe him a jug of beer. Extispacy wasn't a fringe belief. It was institutional. Kings relied on it before battles. Farmers used it before harvest. And yes, nervous lovers offered up livestock to see whether they were spiritually aligned or just really bored and lonely. The liver was considered the seat of emotion and knowledge. The heart, that was just plumbing. Love lived in your liver, which explains a lot about Mesopotamian dating culture. There were actual clay diagrams with tiny labels showing what each part of the liver symbolized. A crease in one lobe could mean divine favor. A bump could spell disaster. If a vein looked weird or the surface was shiny, you might be cursed. There were over 40 known omens, and they all came down to one terrifying truth. Your fate was literally in someone else's hands, squishing around in a warm organ. You glance nervously at the sheep liver in front of you. It looks like something you once found behind your cousin's outhouse. The priest announces your romantic future with grave sincerity. You will meet someone new. You will be disappointed. There may be frogs involved. You're advised not to travel west. You shuffle away as politely as possible while avoiding eye contact with the dead sheep. If liver readings feel like an extreme way to approach romance, keep in mind that Mesopotamians didn't just believe in fate. They believed fate could be negotiated, bribed, and occasionally yelled at through ritual. Omens were part of everyday life. Birds, lightning, dreams, liver bumps. Everything could mean something if you squinted hard enough and had enough beer. In fact, there were entire schools devoted to this. Priests and diviners trained for years to interpret the guts of animals with terrifying confidence. They even wrote handbooks. If the gallbladder faces north, proceed with the relationship. If the bile duct is missing, your lover is unfaithful. If the liver is too dry, you probably left it on the altar too long, and the gods are annoyed. But not all love-based liver readings were meant to prevent disaster. Some were optimistic. A double-lobed liver? That might mean twins. A particularly juicy sample? Strong fertility. A liver shaped like a crescent moon. Good chance of meeting someone at a festival, ideally sober. Just remember to bring more than one sheep. You might need a second opinion. You duck into a nearby shade structure to escape the heat and the smell of simmering fate. A man is there selling tiny clay amulets shaped like livers. One has a smiling face scratched into it. He says it's for good luck in marriage. Another is frowning. He says it protects you from bad suitors. The third is cracked and oddly moist. You do not ask questions. Nearby, a teenage couple argues about whether their sheep's liver means they're compatible or cursed. The priest shrugs. He says it depends on whether they paid him in advance. Marriage here was not just a personal arrangement. It was a political act, a survival tactic, and a spiritual gamble. Entrails just made it official. If the gods didn't like your partner, they'd let you know via a suspiciously veiny sheep liver and a priest who smelled like onions and divine judgment. And yet, despite the strangeness, this wasn't considered bizarre. It was common sense. In a world full of floods, wars, plagues, and that one guy who keeps stealing your barley, why wouldn't you check the guts first? You step outside and spot a new bride standing near the temple steps holding a small bundle. She unwraps it to reveal a bit of dried liver pressed between two tablets. She says it's from her wedding day, a keepsake. You nod and pretend not to gag. Romance in ancient Mesopotamia was never simple. It was layered, legal, sacrificial, slightly fermented, and above all, always supervised by someone holding a knife and a very serious expression. You walk back through the city as dusk settles. The priest is now roasting the leftover sheep. Nothing is wasted. Not the body, not the liver, and definitely not the emotional trauma of watching your love life determined by internal organs. As the stars begin to appear, you realise something uncomfortable. You're going to need another sheep, this time for someone else's liver reading. Apparently your cousin is getting engaged tomorrow. You sigh and make a mental note to avoid the West, but not every relationship began with liver. Some began with sweat, literally. Because next, you're going to learn how Mesopotamians used magical armpit rituals to seduce potential lovers. And yes, it's exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. You make it halfway across the courtyard before realising something smells worse than usual. Not just livestock bad, not just hot mud after rain bad. This is new. This is pungent. This is someone's ancient attempt at love. A woman steps out from behind a linen curtain, holding what looks like a beeswax pot. She dabs it onto her underarms with a carved ivory spatula and whispers something under her breath. You're not entirely sure if it's a prayer or a threat. Either way, she's glistening and determined. Her target is a man 3 stalls down, who is currently engaged in an argument with a fishmonger about whether the eel he just bought is still legally alive. Love in ancient Mesopotamia didn't begin with flowers or first dates. It began with scent. Not perfume in the modern sense, though. This was closer to potion work. A blend of oils, sweat, crushed herbs, animal fat, and the occasional questionable root. The theory was simple. If you could control someone's nose, you could control their heart. Sumerians believed the body had heat, and heat meant life, and life meant power. When that heat mixed with certain oils or resins, it created a kind of aura, a radiating influence that could attract attention, manipulate desire, or in some cases permanently stain your tunic. This wasn't just folk magic. These practices were inscribed in cuneiform on medical and ritual tablets, categorized alongside disease remedies and weather omens. There were entire recipes dedicated to love, most of which began with something like, render the fat of a young ram and mix with the dried sweat of a virgin. Some were even more unsettling. One recipe suggested catching a beetle under the full moon, boiling it with pine resin and dabbing the mixture behind the ears. The resulting paste supposedly made you irresistible. It also made you smell like roasted forest. And while Mesopotamians valued cleanliness in theory, bathing was irregular at best. That meant these aromatic rituals were often applied over bodies that hadn't seen water in several moons. The results were somewhere between enchanting and catastrophic. You pass a vendor selling perfume cones made from compressed myrrh and date syrup. He explains that you're meant to wear them on top of your head. The cone melts over the course of the day, trickling scented oil down your hair and neck like a slow, sticky waterfall of alleged sex appeal. You nod politely and step back before he offers you a sample. Oils were expensive. Frankincense, myrrh, cedarwood, rose and cinnamon all had to be imported from far-off lands, often arriving in cracked ceramic pots that cost more than a small goat. Which is to say, smelling decent in Mesopotamia was not just a luxury. It was an economic status symbol. Priests and temple workers sometimes controlled access to these ingredients, mixing love potions with the same care they gave to sacred incense. Some even offered custom blends for specific romantic goals. Want someone to notice you in a crowd? Try a blend of camphor, goat butter and crushed river reeds. Want them to forget your name forever? Burn a bitter root while smearing your face with fish oil and sleep under a fig tree. But not all scent-based rituals were about attraction. Some were preventative. There were rituals designed to drive away unwanted suitors by making yourself smell spiritually unavailable. One tablet advises single women to carry a charm made of dried animal entrails wrapped in linen soaked in juniper and ashes. The idea was that spirits would flee. So would men. It was surprisingly effective. Nearby, a scribe is writing a love poem on a clay tablet while fanning himself with a palm frond. He occasionally pauses to sniff his own armpit, which he's clearly treated with something sticky and ambitious. The poem is dedicated to a temple dancer and includes several lines about her scent, which he describes as like the first harvest of date wine in the sun. You wonder if that's supposed to be romantic or just fermented. Scent in Mesopotamia wasn't just about bodies, it was about environment. Love rituals often involved burning incense in enclosed rooms and chanting prayers while bathing in scented smoke. The smoke would cling to your skin, hair, and clothes. If your crush didn't fall for you immediately, you could always hope they were too overwhelmed by the smell to escape. You duck into a shaded archway to avoid another group of dancers coated in almond oil and what might be melted pigeon fat. A boy is waving a perfumed fan at an elderly merchant. You try not to breathe through your nose. Underneath all the ritual and oil, there was a deeply human concern. Mesopotamians, like everyone else, feared rejection. They wanted to be noticed, wanted to be desirable, wanted to believe they could shape their own fortunes using what they had access to. And sometimes what they had access to was a jar of goose grease and a surprisingly potent onion. Scent was power, it was influence, it was the difference between being seen as sacred or stinky. And in a world where gods walked among mortals and lovers turned into enemies over a bad batch of barley wine, anything that offered an edge was worth the effort. You cross the courtyard and spot a young man wearing a necklace of garlic bulbs. He says it wards off curses. He also says it makes his wife more attracted to him. You can't tell if she's laughing or crying. As the sun dips low behind the ziggurat, the air fills with the blended fumes of 20 different oils, 12 types of incense, and at least one unfortunate cat who got into a ritual mixture and now refuses to come down from the roof. You breathe shallowly and press forward through the haze of history. Somewhere up ahead you hear music, drums, flutes, someone chanting in a circle. It sounds like a wedding, or possibly a breakup ceremony. Because as strange as ancient seduction was, nothing compares to how they handled divorce. You're about to learn what happened when Mesopotamian marriages went spectacularly wrong. Spoiler. It involves fire, shaving, and several very angry goats. You follow the music down a narrow alley, dodging a pair of dancing children covered in powdered resin and sesame oil. The rhythm is catchy, the scene is festive, the smell is somewhere between roasted chickpeas and disappointment. You expect a wedding, maybe a betrothal. But the woman in the centre of the crowd is holding a clay tablet in one hand and a pair of scissors in the other. Her husband stands nearby looking like he would rather be anywhere else, including a plague pit. This is not a wedding, it is a public Mesopotamian divorce. Contrary to popular belief, breaking up was not invented in the 20th century. Ancient Mesopotamians were way ahead of you. If love was a contract, then divorce was a cancellation clause, with emotional shrapnel and occasional livestock disputes. These separations could be quiet, negotiated, and transactional, but more often they looked exactly like this: loud, public, hair-related. The Sumerians had a word for divorce. It shows up on clay tablets dated over 4,000 years ago. The earliest law codes, including the Code of Ur-Nammu and later Hammurabi's Code, offered explicit instructions for how to end a marriage. These were not vague. They specified what happened to dowries, what could trigger a divorce, and which partner got the goats. A man could initiate divorce for many reasons: infertility, disobedience, financial problems, even excessive nagging, although the legal definition of nagging appears to be subjective and suspiciously one-sided. If he wanted out, all he had to do was pay compensation to the wife's family and return her dowry. Sometimes he could skip the payment if he proved infidelity. Whether or not she actually cheated was sometimes considered optional, depending on how loud he was. But if a woman wanted to initiate the divorce, she had to do a little more than complain. She had to prove neglect, abuse, or abandonment. She might plead her case before a panel of elders or temple officials. If they agreed, she could be granted release from the marriage, but not without consequences. She might lose her property. She might lose custody of her children. In extreme cases, she might lose her hair. Yes, hair. One of the more theatrical divorce customs involved publicly shaving the woman's head. This was a visual symbol of her release from the role of wife, and in some communities it was also used to shame or humiliate her, depending on why the divorce occurred. Sometimes both spouses shaved their heads in a mutual agreement. Other times, the scissors came out with spite. You watch as the woman in the street slowly cuts a lock of her own hair and drops it into a bowl of water. The crowd murmurs. This is a symbolic act, one that says the bond is broken. She spits into the bowl after the hair, stirring it with a reed stick. The husband is supposed to spit too. He does. It's more of a dribble. He doesn't make eye contact. The priest overseeing the ritual nods solemnly. Public rituals like this weren't required, but they were popular. A good divorce ceremony allowed the community to see that the separation was official, reducing the risk of accusations, confusion, or unfortunate remarriages involving mistaken identity and shared sheep. There were even offerings made to deities to witness the split. In some cases, a couple might visit the Temple of Ishtar or Shamash and leave a small statue representing their union. Once the divorce was complete, the statue would be broken ceremonially and the pieces buried. Symbolism was taken very seriously. So was pottery. Nothing said it was over like smashing a small baked clay effigy of your relationship into the dust. Dowries were a major concern. These were not casual gifts. They included land, jewellery, livestock, and sometimes servants. When a marriage ended, the return of the dowry was a complex negotiation. If the wife had misbehaved, the husband might withhold it. If he had wronged her, he could be forced to return it with extra compensation. One tablet outlines a case where a man had to return 3 goats and 1 bronze earring after accusing his wife of witchcraft without evidence. The goats were fine. The earring had been melted down. Children added another layer of tension. Custody was usually granted to the father unless the mother could prove he was unfit or had abandoned the family. In a few rare cases, children were split between parents, like heirloom furniture. 1 child to the mother, 1 to the father, and the youngest often handed off to extended family or temple guardianship. Yes, temple custody battles were a thing. No one liked them. You move through the crowd and notice the mood shifting. The couple is now seated on stools facing opposite directions. This signals the final stage. The priest recites an oath while holding a pot of river water. They are to drink from it, symbolising the washing away of their shared bond. The husband drinks, the wife drinks. The water is probably not clean, but tradition wins. In some parts of Mesopotamia, a divorced woman could re-enter society freely. She might remarry, return to her family, or even become a temple worker. Others face stigma, especially if the divorce involved accusations of adultery or witchcraft. These women might be forbidden from entering certain festivals or cast out of family networks. Some voluntarily became Nadatu priestesses to escape the social mess entirely. And yet, despite the occasional public haircut and ceremonial spitting, divorce was not uncommon. It was part of life. As common as trade disputes, barley theft, and the occasional neighbour who built their goat shed 1 cubit too far into your irrigation ditch. It was acknowledged, documented, and sometimes celebrated with food. Yes, there are records of post-divorce feasts. Nothing says personal growth like roasted duck and awkward small talk. The newly divorced couple finishes the ritual. The priest stamps a small seal onto a clay tablet and hands it to the woman. Her marriage is officially dissolved. She bows slightly. The man scratches his armpit and shuffles away. A group of older women clap politely. One of them hands her a fresh headscarf. She's now legally single and slightly bald. You slip away from the scene and into a quiet alley lined with incense vendors and old men drinking sour beer from ceramic cups. One of them offers you a drink. You decline. He laughs and says his wife left him 20 years ago because he bought a sick donkey. You nod sympathetically and do not ask for details. There is something oddly refreshing about how transparent the Mesopotamians were about divorce. Brutal, yes. Occasionally unsanitary, certainly, but honest. And somehow, despite the haircuts and curse accusations, it all feels very civilized. You turn a corner and nearly collide with a woman in a ceremonial robe carrying a small goat under one arm and a bronze ladle in the other. She says she's going to prepare a love potion for her next husband. She winks. The goat bleats. You step aside. Not everyone gave up after a bad marriage. Some got bolder, louder, scented, slightly more dangerous. And some summoned the gods directly. You take a slow breath and try to air out your tunic, which now smells faintly of spit water, burnt incense and barley sweat. It's been a day. But as you reach the edge of the temple district, the atmosphere changes. Literally. The scent of ash and livestock gives way to something softer. Honey, myrrh, dried rose petals soaked in date oil, and something else you cannot name but would absolutely not put near your face. You're at the gates of a shrine dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love, war, fertility, and what can only be described as cosmic-level romantic chaos. There is a painted mural of her above the entrance, eyes wide, lips parted, hair flowing like a storm caught in clay. In one hand she holds a sword, in the other a flowering reed. It is very unclear whether she wants to bless you or ruin your life. Inside, women in layered robes drift between stone columns, lighting oil lamps and humming in low, hypnotic tones. This is not a regular temple. This is a matchmaking engine built from divine protocol, lunar calendars, and the careful application of scented wax to very specific parts of the body. These are the sacred love workers of Inanna, and this is where people came to fall in love, beg for children, recover from heartbreak, or just spend an afternoon in ceremonial embrace that might technically also count as a religious tax deduction. The Sumerians did not separate love from worship. To them, romantic and physical connection were gifts from the divine. The temple priestesses and sacred sex workers served as intermediaries. Their job was to channel the goddess's power into the mortal world. That meant healing the sick, praying for harvests, performing rituals, and occasionally sleeping with someone to improve their odds of conception or good fortune. This was not considered scandalous. It was respected, ritualized, documented on thousands of clay tablets that spelled out who, when, why, and what the appropriate payment in beer or livestock should be. You wander deeper into the temple, shoes crunching over scattered petals and tiny beads of blue glass. The walls are carved with scenes of Inanna's mythical descent into the underworld, her dramatic love life, and what appears to be a man riding a bull while crying. You choose not to ask. A priestess approaches. She wears kohl around her eyes and a necklace of copper discs that jingle softly when she moves. She tells you this is a holy day, the first full moon of the planting season, a time when matchmaking rituals are performed in her goddess's name. You are apparently just in time for the bread ceremony. You're handed a small loaf of barley flatbread shaped like a human figure. It's slightly warm and smells like cumin. You're told to whisper the name of someone you desire into its doughy chest, and then offer it on the temple altar. If the goddess approves, your affections will be returned. If not, the bread will go stale within the hour. This is divine ghosting. The ritual is older than the city itself. Ancient inscriptions describe love festivals where entire communities gathered to reenact the sacred union between Inanna and her consort Dumuzi. Couples would engage in public declarations of love, write poems, perform dances, and sometimes go off behind a curtain to consummate their divine roles. These were not private affairs. They were communal, blessed by the priesthood, and occasionally sponsored by local bakers. You sit in the corner of the courtyard, watching a man nervously carve a love poem into a palm-sized tablet. He mumbles to himself, occasionally licking the stylus. His lines are surprisingly sweet. He compares his lover's voice to the cooing of doves and her thighs to polished ivory. You hope she's not lactose intolerant. Nearby, a woman holds a painted fan and a prayer scroll. She's waiting for the high priestess to perform a reading of compatibility based on lunar alignment and birth hour. If the stars match, the couple will be assigned a ceremonial chamber for spiritual bonding. If the stars clash, they will be offered a mild sedative tea and a lecture on patience. Divine matchmaking wasn't random. It relied on omens, sacred mathematics, and detailed dream interpretation. One preserved text outlines a case where a man dreamed of a lion eating dates under a palm tree. The temple priests debated for 3 days. Eventually they concluded that he should marry a brewer's daughter and avoid sheep until the next solstice. These weren't just temple games. For many Mesopotamians, these rituals offered hope, a structure for love in a world full of disease, famine, and legal clay disputes about irrigation channels. If the gods had a hand in your love life, maybe you stood a chance. Of course, not all divine unions were successful. There are records of rejected offerings, bread that moulded too fast, incense that refused to light, dreams where Inanna appeared and told the petitioner to stop whining. These were considered signs to either move on or bathe more often. You walk past a fountain filled with rose water and dried mint leaves. A young couple is performing a ritual of union, where they circle each other 3 times while tying a thread between their wrists. The priestess overseeing it hums a tune that sounds suspiciously like last week's barley festival anthem. The couple seems happy, or at least well-oiled. You notice a side chamber where women are being instructed in the sacred arts. Not just intimacy, music, poetry, hospitality, herbal medicine. Temple workers were educated, trained, and held in high regard. Many were part of the Narrated class, women who lived in temple quarters, took vows and wielded financial and social power. Some even owned property, signed contracts, and managed staff. You find a quiet bench under a fig tree and reflect on the staggering complexity of Mesopotamian romance. It wasn't accidental, it wasn't casual, it was engineered, blessed, bathed, perfumed, and occasionally shouted into the moon. A bell chimes somewhere in the distance. A new ceremony is starting. This one involves red dye, salt water, and the sacrifice of something that looks like a ceremonial pastry shaped like an ear. You stand and stretch. It's time to move on. There's talk of a festival happening near the river, one where hopeful singles exchange love amulets made from bones and reeds, and where rejected lovers toss theirs into the water and curse whoever invented emotional vulnerability. You should probably check that out. The festival is louder than expected. Somewhere nearby, a flute shrieks in the wrong key. A boy is selling honey-coated figs shaped like fish. Someone has already vomited into a ceremonial basket. You watch as a group of women in dyed linen robes wade into the edge of the river holding small charms in their palms. One by one, they whisper to the water and release the objects into the current like strange, soggy prayers. This is not a celebration. This is closure. Welcome to the Mesopotamian river rite of rejection, when a romantic bond failed, or worse, never began at all. Sumerians and Akkadians had a ritual for letting it go. Sometimes it was quiet, sometimes it involved a priest and a goat, but most often it meant crafting a personalised love amulet, cursing it and tossing it into the nearest body of sacred water while glaring dramatically at the horizon. The most popular destination for this passive-aggressive performance was the Tigris, a long, moody river with a proven track record of swallowing hopes and occasionally entire villages. You lean in for a closer look. One woman is holding a small clay disc engraved with cuneiform. The edges are chipped. She traces her finger over it and mutters something that sounds like a lullaby sung angrily. Then she flings the disc into the water with the emotional precision of someone who has absolutely not moved on. Another person hurls a tiny figurine carved from date seed. It's wearing what might be a conical hat. You assume it represents the one who wronged her. It hits the water with a splash and is promptly eaten by a fish. Love charms were not casual trinkets. They were sacred items crafted with intention, sometimes made of bone, reed, wax, or fired clay. Some included inscriptions. Others bore the impression of a seal pressed with a family symbol or the image of a god. These were not just symbols of affection. They were tools. And if things went wrong, they became tools of vengeance. You spot a vendor under a canopy of dyed wool offering a tray of pre-made amulets. Each one is labelled with a different spell. Some promise attraction. Others offer protection from jealousy. A few are explicitly labelled for revenge. One particularly aggressive tablet reads, "May the mouth of my enemy be filled with bitter salt." That one is popular today. Several have already been flung into the river with satisfying velocity. Mesopotamians viewed love as deeply entangled with spiritual forces. That meant unrequited affection, or betrayal required ritual resolution. The river wasn't just a place to cry into, it was an active participant, a sacred current capable of carrying your emotions downstream to be judged by the gods, or at least recycled into someone else's fishing net. There are written spells preserved from this tradition. One tablet from ancient Lagash describes a love charm wrapped in goat hair, buried near a riverbank for 3 nights, then retrieved and broken with a single word. The spell invokes Ishtar, goddess of passion and war, and requests that the unfaithful lover be stricken with forgetfulness and a rash. It is not subtle. Another charm describes shaping wax into the form of your beloved, placing it in a bowl of river mud, and leaving it under moonlight until it softens and breaks apart. This symbolises the melting of the bond, or possibly just a very messy form of therapy. Either way, it worked for someone. You sit on a warm rock near the bank and watch as a group of teenagers perform a rejection circle. They link arms, chant something in rhythmic Sumerian, and toss bundles of reeds into the water. Each bundle contains a feather, a pinch of salt, and a written complaint. One boy's note reads, "She said my tunic was boring." Another simply says, "He lied about owning a donkey." The river accepts them all. Reed charms were especially common among young lovers, easy to make, easy to destroy, thin bundles tied with red string and infused with spices or scented oils. You could carry one around your wrist, wear it under your clothes, or hide it under your crush's bed if you had a flair for romantic espionage. If it worked, the target would dream of you. If it didn't, you were supposed to burn the reed and promise not to talk about it again. Of course, not all charms were symbolic. Some were pharmaceutical. There are records of love potions sold at river festivals. Ingredients included crushed seeds, fermented fruit skins, and in one tablet something described as essence of boiled frog. The mixture was steeped in beer and consumed during a full moon. Side effects may have included affection, hallucinations, or death. Results varied. Across the river, a priest in formal robes begins a ritual to unbind a cursed marriage. The couple kneels beside him, holding twin amulets tied with a single cord. The cord is cut. The charms are placed into a jar of ash and buried beside the river. It is quiet, serious, a bit damp. 2 children nearby are using the opportunity to throw frogs at each other. Rituals like these were not just magical, they were legal. A properly conducted charm ceremony could serve as proof of intent. Some contracts even mention charm rites as official break clauses. If the bond is broken, the amulet shall be drowned and the bride shall return to her family. That's a direct quote from a 3,800-year-old tablet. Romance was very official. You step aside as a man carrying a fish basket wades into the river. He finds a small tablet floating in the reeds. He reads it, frowns, and sets it gently back into the water. It is unclear if this was kindness or self-preservation. Night falls over the river. The last of the charms disappear into the current. The flute player from earlier begins a slower tune. The rejection circle dissolves into snack stands and tired chatter. A girl gives her friend a new amulet. This one is made of bone, carved with a heart, and tied with a fresh blue thread. Hope, it seems, floats too. You stand and stretch, brushing off dust and loose petals from your tunic. As you step away from the water, you notice a small shrine lit by a single oil lamp. Inside is a basket filled with broken charms and melted wax figures. Offerings returned to the temple by people who changed their minds. Love in Mesopotamia was not a simple arc. It bent, snapped, restarted, and occasionally caught fire. But it was always intentional, always ritualized. Even the heartbreak had paperwork. And speaking of paperwork, you're about to stumble into the world of legal love tablets, the contracts, the clauses, the terrifying specificity. Because next, you're going to learn how romance became a binding agreement with witnesses, fines, and signature seals made from pressed snail shells. You finally leave the riverbank just as someone lights a bundle of sage and accidentally sets their sandal on fire. The crowd barely flinches. You cut through a quiet alley where a scribe is setting up a small folding table, complete with stylus, ink, and a neat stack of blank clay tablets ready for pressing. There's a sign carved into a hanging wooden plank that reads, quite proudly, "Official Sumerian contracts, wills, and romantic declarations. We stamp what you can't say." This is where love gets legally binding. In ancient Mesopotamia, romance was a business deal with emotional perks. Whether you were getting married, breaking up, gifting someone a dowry goat, or just declaring your intention to cohabitate until death or dramatic scandal, there was a contract for it. And you didn't whisper sweet nothings to your beloved. You dictated them to a middle-aged man who spelled them out in clay and charged extra for decorative seals. You sit on a low bench near the scribe and watch as a couple approaches. They're not holding hands, they're holding two different jars, one filled with barley, the other with a kind of fragrant paste used for sealing documents. This is the Mesopotamian version of popping the question. Only the ring is a baked cylinder with your family's crest pressed into it, and the response comes in the form of a legally enforceable list of expectations. Marriage contracts were not optional, they were the default. Even commoners had written agreements, stored in family shrines or town archives. These tablets outlined everything from property rights to child-rearing duties, and sometimes even sleeping arrangements. One contract from the city of Sipar includes a clause that reads, "If the husband brings a second wife into the house, he must provide equal oil and bread to both women, or be fined 1 silver shekel and 3 public apologies." Public apologies were often ceremonial, and involved shouting your shame outside the city gate. The contract currently being written by the scribe includes the following gems. She shall weave 10 garments per month, not including festival garb. He shall not sell her jewellery unless plague or divine fire strikes. And perhaps the most heartfelt clause of all, any goat gifted during courtship shall remain her property, even if the marriage fails due to dreams of ill omen or loud snoring. Romance at its finest. You lean closer and examine the scribe's toolkit. The stylus is sharpened bone. The tablets are damp and smooth, perfect for inscribing with brutal honesty. Each contract ends with a witness list, often including the names of parents, neighbours, and at least one temple official. The more witnesses, the stronger the contract. In some towns, you could even pay a fee to have the high priest sign your relationship into the sacred record. This did not guarantee happiness, but it did make divorce slightly more complicated. Once inscribed, the tablet was baked in a kiln or sun-dried depending on urgency. A rushed romance might result in a soft, bendable tablet that could technically be reused with a bit of water and shame. Official ones were fired hard and stored in clay jars. Some households kept them on display, right next to the oil jugs and dried fruit. Nothing says commitment like a shelf full of hardened mud slabs, threatening financial ruin if you cheat. Contracts extended beyond marriage. Betrothal agreements included clauses about dowry delivery, bridal training, and what to do if one party mysteriously disappeared in a flood. Gift declarations allowed lovers to exchange items of value without assuming legal debt. "I gift you this bracelet of lapis lazuli in affection, not obligation." That was a real clause. So was, "If the bracelet is returned, so too shall all affection cease." Emotional boundaries were quite literal. There were even contracts used for temporary relationships. These were most common among travellers, merchants, and visiting dignitaries. Known as partnership agreements, they allowed 2 people to live as a couple for a set period, often marked by moon cycles or harvest dates. At the end, they could renew the contract or walk away. No hard feelings, unless someone broke the clause about bathwater etiquette, in which case feelings were extremely hard. You wander toward the central archive where a temple clerk is stacking a fresh batch of contracts into long ceramic tubes. Each tube is labelled by category: marriage, annulment, breach of contract, and one ominous tube titled Unclaimed Brides. You do not ask. Among the most bizarre clauses ever recorded is one from a nobleman in Ur, who demanded his wife feed his pigeons every morning before the 3rd bell, or risk forfeiting her sandal stipend. Another contract from a couple in Nippur specifies that neither spouse may name future children after fruit. It is unknown what inspired this rule, but it was enforced for 3 generations. Enforcement itself was a formal affair. If a clause was violated, the injured party could bring the tablet before a council of elders, often held in the town square or temple courtyard. There, the issue would be read aloud. If the offending spouse was found guilty, they might be fined, flogged, or required to recite a formal apology in front of their mother-in-law. There was a specific tablet designed for this. It included tiny cuneiform hearts to symbolise repentance. You sit near a vendor who sells miniature clay tablets labelled practice vows. These are often used by nervous suitors to rehearse their clauses before hiring a real scribe. One says, "I promise to only insult your brother on feast days." Another reads, "If I forget your name in a crowd, I shall buy you wine immediately." One particularly nervous-looking man clutches a tablet that just says, "Please love me anyway." It is unclear whether this one will be filed or fired into the sun. As the afternoon light shifts, you spot a young woman arriving at the scribe's table with her father. They are drafting a dowry list. It includes 1 wool tunic, 3 measures of beer, half ownership in a donkey, and 1 amulet with a protective inscription against jealousy. The man she's marrying will receive these items upon wedding, but only if he agrees to the clause about weekly foot washing. It is not negotiable. Bureaucracy and romance may sound incompatible, but to the Mesopotamians they were inseparable. Love meant risk meant rules, and rules meant tablets. Hardened clay contracts you could drop on your lover's foot if things got difficult. Some tablets even included exit clauses. If he forgets the festival of her mother, she may reside with her aunt until a goat is sacrificed in penance. This was considered lenient. A temple bell rings. The scribe packs up for the day. His fingers are stained with ink. His pockets jingle with small silver bits. Romance has paid well today. You step into the cooling air and glance back at the now vacant table. 3 new contracts sit on a drying rack. One of them includes a clause about morning flatulence. You hope it works out for them. But not all romantic declarations were legal. Some were poetic, erotic, whispered into the dark or carved clumsily into walls. Next, you're going to discover the clay tablet love poems of ancient Mesopotamia, the metaphors, the heat, the anatomical misunderstandings, and why ancient flirting often involved references to dairy products and irrigation. The sun sinks low over the rooftops as you pass through the merchant quarter, where the smell of hot dust and old lentils clings to everything. A man on the corner is reciting something to a very unimpressed goat. His voice is theatrical. His gestures are grand. You assume he's shouting at the animal until you realise he's holding a clay tablet in one hand and a rose-shaped bundle of dried reeds in the other. He is reciting poetry, love poetry, to a goat. Possibly metaphorical, possibly not. You stop walking, not because it's unusual, but because this sort of thing happens often in Mesopotamia. Ancient Mesopotamians had many ways of expressing desire, but none were quite as personal or as confusing as their love poems. These weren't shy declarations. They were carved into clay, etched onto wall fragments, sometimes even sung at festivals in front of crowds who clapped awkwardly when the metaphors got too specific. What passes for romance in Sumer usually begins with the description of the lover's face, followed closely by an inventory of limbs. A typical poem might start with something like, "Your eyes are like polished lapis," before quickly transitioning into, "Your thighs are twin cedar logs, and your hips are wide as a grain basket." It is passionate. It is earthy. It is occasionally very confusing for archaeologists. You pass a young couple beneath a fig tree. The boy is holding a wax tablet and trying to rhyme something with barley. The girl looks unimpressed. He tries again, this time comparing her to a well-fed donkey. She leaves. The most famous love poems in Mesopotamian history come from temple collections associated with Inanna, goddess of passion and chaos. These are not vague expressions of admiration. They are vivid, intimate. In one preserved piece, the speaker begs their lover to plough my wet field and praises the act of grinding grain as an allegory for physical affection. Another poem opens with, "You have captivated me," and closes with a very detailed metaphor involving cream, reeds, and the lunar calendar. These were not safe for cuneiform class. Some poems were written by women, or at least from the perspective of women. These stanzas often praised the male body in terms of strength, sweetness, and ability to supply oil and wool. One particularly enthusiastic poem refers to the lover's genitals as a boat filled with joy. You assume this was meant romantically, possibly also economically. Writing these poems was not just a matter of emotion, it was ritual. Love poetry was used during religious festivals, especially those celebrating sacred unions. During the spring equinox, priests and priestesses performed symbolic marriages between deities, and the accompanying poems were recited aloud to bring fertility to the land. The soil was blessed with rhythm and innuendo. You wander past a bakery where a scribe is scribbling verses into the damp flour on the countertop. His customer waits patiently while he rhymes buns with suns. The final poem is carved into the bread dough and baked. A literal love loaf. Apparently you can confess your feelings and deliver carbohydrates in one gesture. Efficient. Poetry was also used for courtship. If you wanted to impress someone, you composed verses and left them where they'd find them. Clay tablets placed in baskets. Painted lines hidden under mats. One merchant wrote a series of poems onto his pottery shipments. Each jar carried a verse. If the recipient liked the poetry, they were expected to return the jar with a scented token inside. If they didn't, they broke it. You overhear a child reciting a school poem meant to teach the alphabet through romantic lines. The letter A stands for a reed I give you, B stands for barley as my dowry. C is a problem, because cuneiform doesn't work that way. The teacher improvises. These poems were also political. Royal households commissioned love poems to promote fertility or demonstrate their divine favour. The famous Love Song of Shusin, one of the oldest known love poems in the world, was written for a Sumerian king and meant to be performed during his sacred marriage to a high priestess. The lines are steamy, celebratory, slightly alarming. One verse refers to the king as a wild bull, another asks him to bring his milk to the temple. Ancient metaphors did not always age well. You reach the town square where a poetry competition is underway. A young woman performs a verse comparing her suitor to a date palm, his sweetness to honey, and his scent to fresh-cut rushes. The audience claps. A boy follows with a poem that describes his crush's hands as soft like the sheep's underside, and her breath as the east wind through clean laundry. He is booed. Love poetry was not limited to formal performance. It was scratched into walls, scrawled on pots, and whispered into ears at festivals. A surprisingly large number of erotic poems have been found on discarded tablet fragments. Archaeologists believe these were practice drafts, private stanzas, or perhaps love notes never delivered. One particularly tragic piece ends with "she did not answer." The rest is smudged beyond recognition. You find a tablet resting in a shop window. It's a replica of an old love poem. The shopkeeper offers to translate. The poem begins sweetly, praising the lover's voice and eyes, then descends rapidly into vivid agricultural allegory. By the third line, someone is a vineyard. By the fifth, someone is being harvested with joy. You nod politely and pretend to understand. As strange as these metaphors sound, they made sense in a culture where love, fertility, and survival were deeply tied to the land. To call someone a well-irrigated field or a fertile threshing floor was high praise, slightly dirty praise, but high praise nonetheless. The crowd disperses. The poetry contest ends. The goat that served as a judge is asleep. You head toward the temple gate where an elder scribe is engraving verses onto a ceremonial stone. He hums as he works, pressing each line into the slab like a sacred secret meant to outlast every lover who forgot to write back. And just when you think you've seen every romantic expression possible, you spot something unusual. A man is preparing to dig a shallow pit behind his house. He's carrying a jar filled with olive oil, 2 bronze rings, and what looks like a plucked chicken feather. apparently tonight is ideal for a love-binding spell, the kind that involves knots, wax, vows muttered under breath and buried under moonlight. You might want to stay for this. The man with the chicken feather is digging with remarkable focus. His brow is dripping. His breath smells faintly of dried dates and regret. He checks the moon's position in the sky and hums a rhythmic chant under his breath. A woman nearby holds a bowl of warm olive oil and a pair of bronze rings tied together with a piece of lamb gut string. A small crowd gathers at a polite distance. No one interrupts. Everyone knows what this is. It's a binding ritual, a love spell, and it's not even the strangest one you'll see tonight. In ancient Mesopotamia, if someone didn't return your affection, you had options. You could write poetry, you could bathe more, or you could dig a shallow hole, light a tiny fire, whisper their name into a piece of cooked grain, and bury the whole affair under the stars while asking the goddess Ishtar to violently rearrange their priorities. Love magic was not subtle. It was specific, organised, and usually conducted with ingredients that were either sacred, expired, or stolen. You sit on a smooth rock beside the ritual site and watch as the woman carefully drops the rings into the oil, then coats the string with honey before placing it over the rings in a spiral. The man recites a verse in a whispering tone. It translates loosely to, "May her heart bind to mine as clay binds to fire." He adds, "May she dream of no other man, even the brewer's son with many goats." You sense backstory. The final item is the feather, which is dipped in wine and placed over the bundle like a closing seal. Then everything is wrapped in linen and buried under packed soil, while the priest marks the location with a twig. This spell is called a Kisu and Namutu, a ritual of attraction and fixation. It appears in dozens of Akkadian clay tablets, and is often linked to lunar positions, scented oils, and symbolic objects. The rings represent unity. The string represents control. The feather symbolizes the soul. The chicken, tragically, just symbolizes lunch. Love spells in Mesopotamia were a daily part of life for many. There were tablets specifically designed for attracting a partner, keeping them faithful, driving away rivals, or, in more aggressive cases, making someone suffer emotionally until they returned your borrowed jewellery. These weren't seen as strange. They were woven into the cultural fabric, often performed with the assistance of temple officials or wise women known for their knowledge of celestial timing and acceptable animal substitutions. You pass a vendor's stall draped with amulet cords, scented sachets, and bundles of herbs tied with curse-insulated ribbon. A small sign reads, "Custom love potions available. No refunds. Side effects not covered." A woman in her 50s examines a jar labelled "Desire in the Third Moon" and asks if it smells better when boiled. The vendor assures her it does. She remains unconvinced. Many of these spells relied on symbolism. You might take a lump of clay and mould it into the shape of your target, adding a few drops of their sweat or hair if you had access to it. Then you'd chant a line invoking the goddess or a protective spirit, press the figure against your heart and bury it near a well or a temple gate. If it softened in the night, it meant your love was being received. If ants carried it off, it meant you were cursed with terrible aim. You watch as another man lights a small fire under a clay bowl filled with rose petals, pine sap, and what appears to be finely shredded linen strips soaked in something fermented. He fans the smoke toward a painted figurine of his beloved and declares, "Let her thoughts be filled with my voice." His voice sounds like gravel and indigestion, but the intent is clear. These spells could be gentle or aggressive. One charm instructs the caster to whisper sweet things over a piece of warm bread and place it on the threshold of their desired partner's home. Another instructs you to write their name backward on a wax tablet, melt it into beer, and drink it alone in silence before sunrise. A less friendly version suggests tying a knot into your enemy's tunic string while spitting 3 times into the north wind. This is labelled for those who steal lovers. There are even cuneiform recipes for what scholars now call emotional sabotage. One Akkadian spellbook contains a passage titled to undo the heart of the rival. It involves placing a crushed fig on a shard of pottery and leaving it at the rival's door while reciting an incantation that loosely translates to, "May they trip on their tongue and stumble in affection." The fig, for reasons never explained, must be slightly spoiled. You sit beside a low wall carved with inscriptions. A young girl is painting clay hearts with crushed flower petals and wrapping them in fish skin pouches. These are meant to be hidden in a lover's pillow to ensure pleasant dreams. She explains that if the dreams are sweet, they will fall in love. If they are strange, it means you use the wrong flower. If they are terrifying, you probably use nightshade. She offers you a sample. You politely decline. Love spells were not limited to the desperate. Even married couples used them to keep their partners faithful, especially during festivals or long journeys. One surviving text reads, "To make him forget other women, place 3 drops of myrrh and 1 lock of your hair into his sandals." Another reads, "To remind her of your strength, smear your scent into the linen of her veil." This was before deodorant. The results were unpredictable. You pass a group of teenagers whispering around a fire. One is holding a carved wax tablet shaped like a sheep. She says it contains the name of her crush, and that she plans to melt it into the temple brazier tonight. Her friend suggests adding honey to sweeten the results. Another suggests using garlic for passion. A third suggests doing nothing at all and waiting to be noticed naturally. The others laugh. At the edge of the festival grounds, an elderly priest sits beside a pile of broken amulets. These are failed spells, discarded after too many moons passed without effect. He explains that some people come to unbind themselves. They bury old charms under salt or burn them with bitter herbs to release their hearts from entanglement. It doesn't always work, but sometimes the ritual is enough. You walk back toward the centre of the village as the firelight flickers against the mud brick walls. Somewhere behind you, another chant begins. Another heart hopes. Another spell curls into the night air, twisting into the stars where even the gods might roll their eyes. But not every Mesopotamian believed in magic. Some preferred results backed by ingredients, timing, and ancient recipes measured with far too much animal fat. Now you're going to taste your way through the aphrodisiacs of ancient Sumer, recipes, rituals, roasted lizard tails, and why romantic meals often came with stomach cramps and the faint smell of burnt parsley. The smell hits you before you round the corner. It's thick, sweet, and somehow slightly anxious. A bubbling pot sits on a low fire pit surrounded by spices, dried fruit, and 3 very concerned chickens. A woman is stirring the mixture with a carved wooden spoon. Her sleeves are rolled up. Her hair is tied back. Her expression is the kind of focus you only see when someone is about to feed feelings to someone who has not asked for them. This is not dinner. This is strategy. Across ancient Mesopotamia, love was not just written, chanted, or buried in symbolic wax. Sometimes it was eaten. Sometimes it was force-fed in the form of slow-cooked lentils soaked in goat fat and optimism. Because nothing says desire quite like serving someone a bowl of boiled cucumbers and suggesting it might awaken something in their spirit. You sit cross-legged beside a pair of temple cooks preparing what they call heating food. These dishes appear in medical texts, religious documents, and personal journals scratched onto clay tablets that have survived for thousands of years, mostly because someone had the bright idea to write their dating advice in wet mud. One of the oldest tablets from Nippur includes a list of ingredients described as softening to the heart and stirring to the loins. The list begins with garlic. It does not get more romantic from there. You glance at the simmering pot. Inside are chopped leeks, crushed sesame, ground mustard seed, and what may be roasted beetle shells. The cook assures you this is an ancient love tonic. She stirs it clockwise while chanting under her breath. The chant loosely translates to "let his eyes widen, let his hands reach, let his mouth be mine." The beetle shells add crunch. Ancient aphrodisiacs fell into a few key categories. There were warming foods, believed to stoke the inner fire. There were aromatic dishes, meant to awaken the senses, and there were rare or expensive ingredients, designed to impress by sheer effort or economic recklessness. The most popular aphrodisiac among middle-class lovers was onion, not just because it was affordable, but because it was associated with fertility and vigour. You could eat it raw, cook it in stew, or mash it into a paste and apply it to your neck. Some did all three, at once. You pass a stand where an elderly man is selling love snacks wrapped in leaves. One contains dates stuffed with nuts and fish paste. Another is a honey cake infused with saffron and something he refuses to name. He tells you that his third wife fell in love with him after eating one of these. She also lost her sense of taste for a week. He considers both outcomes a win. Among the upper classes, love meals were extravagant. Recipes involving truffles, bird tongues, and fermented dairy sauces appear in royal documents and banquet records. One particularly famous meal, hosted by a priest-king of Lagash, included grilled eel glazed in fig syrup and dusted with powdered pearl. The entire dish was served inside a hollowed-out melon and presented with a prayer. 3 people fainted, 2 eloped. 1 declared himself married to the goddess of river frogs. Herbal aphrodisiacs were common too. Mandrake root was believed to encourage fertility. Fenugreek was used to make the breath sweet and the stomach slightly ambitious. Myrrh, when steeped in wine and mixed with ground pistachio, was believed to stir desire in both the body and the eyebrows. The results were mixed. One love spell included a recipe for a syrup containing mint, honey, ash, and powdered brick. Scholars still argue whether this was meant to be ingested or weaponized. You step over a discarded cutting board and watch as a boy arranges a plate of steamed barley shaped like a heart. He has carved a tiny inscription into the grain using a fishbone. It says, "You're like oil to my pan." His friends nod approvingly. One pats his shoulder and hands him a dried fig soaked in vinegar. They eat together in silence. It is, undeniably, a bonding moment. In the temple kitchens, apprentices are preparing ceremonial seduction platters. These include flatbread decorated with symbols of fertility, bowls of thick cream drizzled with tamarind, and small birds stuffed with nuts and raisins. The platter is placed before a statue of Ishtar. A single candle is lit. A petition is read aloud. If the candle flickers 3 times, the offering is accepted. If it goes out, the food is repurposed into a slightly awkward lunch. Of course, not all attempts were noble. There are tablets that describe deceptive food rituals. One spell instructs you to hide a crushed scorpion tail in a lover's stew, to ensure they dream only of you. Another suggests soaking dried fruit in tears collected during fasting, and wrapping them in a lover's garment before feeding. These recipes were banned in several temple districts due to complaints of emotional indigestion. You pause beside a group of musicians eating from a shared platter of lentils and roasted roots. One of them insists the meal was prepared using a sacred recipe, passed down through 3 generations of romantics. It includes red spice, slow-simmered lamb, and a whisper of salt applied by someone thinking lustful thoughts. When asked what happens if no one is thinking lustful thoughts, the group shrugs and says the lamb usually makes up for it. Street food had its own role. Vendors sold pastries known as kisses, filled with date syrup and crushed nuts. They were often stamped with images of animals known for fertility. Turtles were surprisingly popular. So were birds with exaggerated tail feathers. Eating these snacks in front of your intended partner was a bold move. Dropping one dramatically while making eye contact was considered a proposal. You walk past a shrine where a woman is ladling soup into bowls arranged in a triangle. She explains this is part of a ritual to bring balance between desire, devotion, and digestion. The broth is thick with lentils, garlic, and a root that smells like burnt mint and soap. She insists it works. Her husband agrees, then coughs. It's getting late. The food smells grow heavier, more complex. You feel a little lightheaded, possibly from inhaling too much saffron steam. A group gathers for the final feast. One table serves salted duck over figs. Another offers a stew of lentils and cinnamon, said to awaken the joy of pursuit. A third presents boiled fish in a bowl made from pressed herbs and dried bread. No one knows what it means. Everyone eats it anyway. As the last plates are scraped clean, You spot a young man writing a note in the grease left on his bowl. It says, "I will always stew for you." He shows it to the girl beside him. She laughs. They share a fig. You head back toward the edge of the temple plaza. The candles flicker. The music fades. The smell of garlic and goat lingers on the breeze. And just when you think things might finally be digesting, someone pulls out a reed pipe and starts singing about forbidden love between a brewer and a high priestess's brother-in-law. That story will have to wait. Because now we'll explore the world of scandalous love triangles, political seduction, and romantic affairs that nearly toppled city-states. The song about the brewer and the priestess's brother-in-law ends abruptly when someone knocks over a wine jug. A wave of sticky liquid spreads across the stone floor, and a sharp-eyed scribe steps in to record the damage before anyone even thinks about cleaning it up. Not because he cares about sanitation. He just knows that wherever spilled wine and broken pottery appear, scandal is usually not far behind. Welcome to the part of love that Mesopotamians didn't talk about unless they had to. The part with secrets, affairs, whispered accusations, political plots with heavy eyeliner and suspicious amounts of ceremonial bathing. You cross into the temple's inner archive courtyard, where rows of clay tablets are stacked like dusty promises. These are not poems, these are records, testimonies, complaints, allegations that usually begin with phrases like, "he was seen," "she was heard," or "someone's sandals were in the wrong house at the wrong time." In ancient Mesopotamia, love could get you fined, exiled, imprisoned, or married off to someone with an unfortunate number of goats and a terrible singing voice. The scribes here are quiet, professional, efficient. They do not gossip, they simply record it. You sit near a tablet labelled "Incident at the Moon Gate," which outlines an affair between a temple guard and the daughter of a noble who had already been promised to a merchant family in a different city. The affair lasted 5 weeks. It ended with a broken engagement, 2 lawsuits, and one remarkably large donation to the temple's goat fund. The lovers were caught when someone noticed they kept requesting the same food offerings and leaving behind matching fig stems. Forbidden relationships were everywhere. Some crossed class lines, others crossed sacred boundaries. Temple priestesses, especially those tied to high-ranking deities like Inanna or Shamash, were often restricted from certain romantic entanglements. Their bodies were considered consecrated, their unions symbolic. So when one of them developed feelings for a fishmonger's son with surprisingly good shoulders and a talent for flute playing, things got complicated. One surviving complaint written by a temple official in the city of Eridu accuses a young priestess of exchanging unauthorized glances with a man who regularly delivered freshwater eels. The complaint escalated to include laughter near sacred columns and a suspicious shortage of ritual incense in the week following. She was reassigned to roof maintenance. He was asked to deliver eels through the back entrance. Neither obeyed. Political marriages were the backbone of elite Mesopotamian society. Love was not required. In some cases, it was discouraged. Marriages united land holdings, forged trade routes, and sometimes prevented open war. A noblewoman from Kish might be married off to a prince from Uruk to ensure that her father's barley shipments were not mysteriously delayed. If she also happened to love a scribe with good teeth and bad timing, that was considered deeply inconvenient. You walk past a mural depicting a royal wedding. The groom stands stiffly in a linen robe. The bride holds a jug of wine and a look of resignation. In the background, a servant carries a clay tablet. That tablet does not contain poetry. It contains the clauses. If either party is caught fraternizing with anyone not approved by their family or the temple council, they forfeit half of their personal property and must offer a public apology while wearing ceremonial shame sandals. Those sandals were real. They were made of clay, extremely uncomfortable, and painted with symbols representing foolishness and moral error. Walking through town in them was a visual statement of your romantic misstep. Not all forbidden love ended in tragedy. Some just got very creative. A famous case from Lagash tells of 2 lovers who met weekly at a shared well under the pretense of collecting water for their aging relatives. Their affair lasted nearly a year before they were exposed by a neighbour who noticed their buckets always returned suspiciously full. They were tried by the temple council. Their punishment? A vow of separation and 6 months of compulsory poetry transcription. The poetry was reportedly awful. You sit in a quiet alcove where someone has carved a confession into the wall. It reads, "I did not mean to love her, but the gods did not ask me." Beside it is another inscription, possibly written later, that reads, "You should have meant not to." The handwriting suggests this was not a friendly exchange. Temple politics were especially volatile when it came to love. Positions of power were inherited, guarded, and occasionally manipulated through romantic entanglements. If you seduced the wrong assistant, the high priest, you might find yourself relocated to a field post outside city limits, where your job included counting birds and reporting whether they seemed suspicious. There are tablets describing strategic seduction. One record details a young man who attempted to seduce the niece of a powerful merchant to gain access to shipping routes. His plan failed when he accidentally delivered a love tablet meant for her to her mother instead. The tablet included a drawing. The drawing was not appropriate. The repercussions of romantic missteps varied. Some were legal, others were religious. In one case, a priest accused of defiling a sacred rite through an affair was made to sleep for a week on the temple roof and survive only on rainwater and whatever food could be delivered by birds. He claimed divine insight after the 4th day. Most believed he just missed olives. You pass a courtyard where an old woman is telling a group of children the story of a prince who fell in love with a sculptor's apprentice. The story ends with the apprentice being appointed court artist and the prince marrying a woman from another kingdom. The children cheer. The old woman laughs. She says that love is like wind in a jar. Contain it, and it gets stale. Let it out, and everything flies off the shelf. The reality of Mesopotamian forbidden love was rarely that poetic. Most ended with one party married to someone else, and the other reassigned, relocated, or quietly forgotten. But the stories lingered. Some were written down. Others passed through generations as whispered warnings or hopeful daydreams. And just as you're about to leave the temple archives, a young scribe drops a fresh tablet onto the table. It's a formal complaint. It mentions an unsanctioned kiss near the ziggurat and a missing ritual scarf. The scandal continues, but there is another kind of love worth exploring. The kind not between partners, but between mothers and sons, fathers and daughters, brothers, sisters, extended families who never left. You follow the sound of a broom slapping against a clay floor and arrive at a courtyard already filled with too many voices for the space to handle. A woman is yelling, not in anger, but in the volume of someone who has raised 4 children, 3 goats, and 1 extremely stubborn husband. She's scolding a teenage boy who just spilled grain over a freshly cleaned mat. He apologizes while his sister tries to sweep it up. His uncle complains about his back, and his grandmother sits in the corner muttering prayers to the household gods while throwing salt at everyone just in case. This is what love looks like inside a Mesopotamian home. Not romantic, not poetic, but loud, relentless, deeply structured affection wrapped in chores, duty, and a fair amount of passive-aggressive pottery stacking. You step out of the way as 2 children run past carrying a clay jug that may or may not contain beer. A man leans out from a side room and asks if anyone has seen his ceremonial sandals. He claims someone moved them. His wife reminds him he has not owned ceremonial sandals since the last festival 3 years ago. He retreats. Mesopotamian families were not small. A typical household included parents, children, in-laws, widowed cousins, apprentices, elderly relatives, livestock, household spirits, and possibly a hired worker who never left. Privacy did not exist. Walls were thin, rooms were shared. Emotional boundaries were about as firm as wet papyrus. If someone loved you, they showed it by hovering while you ate, critiquing your posture, and arranging your marriage before your voice changed. The family was the basic social unit of Mesopotamian life. It determined your status, your occupation, your alliances, and sometimes even your religion. Lineage was critical. Names carried weight. Clay tablets were kept to prove who begat whom, going back generations. Forgetting a cousin's name was less offensive than forgetting which irrigation canal your grandfather managed. You pass a room where two brothers are arguing over inheritance. One of them waves a tablet like a sword. The other gestures wildly at a goat that seems to be the subject of dispute. Their father watches from a stool, sipping tea, not because he enjoys the argument, but because this is his third time settling it, and he wants to finish his drink first. The law was very clear on family roles. Fathers held legal authority. They could arrange marriages, approve contracts, and discipline children. Mothers managed the household economy, oversaw servants, and trained daughters in the arts of weaving, food preparation, and surviving emotional nonsense with grace and sarcasm. Love between parents and children was rarely expressed verbally. It was baked into routine. A child fed before dawn. A daughter taught how to grind flour without cracking her knuckles. A son warned not to trust the neighbour with the lopsided roof. One tablet from Sippar outlines a father's advice to his son. It begins with financial wisdom, detours into warnings about flirtatious girls with questionable sandals, and ends with the phrase, "Do not let your mother catch you being idle, for she has sharp eyes and a sharper spoon." Elders were deeply respected, partly out of love, partly because they remembered everything. An elderly matriarch could end a family feud by reminding everyone who married whom, during which flood and why that still matters. Grandparents passed down not just stories but medicinal recipes, legal workarounds, and the proper curse to use when your cousin steals your fish. You move through the kitchen, which doubles as a sleeping area, where a girl is cooking lentils while also mending a tunic and reminding her younger brother not to chew on the goat's leash. Her mother gives her a nod of approval. That nod is worth more than any poem. Affection in Mesopotamian homes was deeply practical. A husband built his wife a sturdy shelf. A wife made her husband a cloak that repelled rain and compliments. Children gifted their parents small woven bracelets or performed small tasks without being asked. If someone gave you extra dates, they loved you. If they gave you their second best cup and wiped it with the clean end of their sleeve, they were considering adoption. Disputes were common. Resolutions were swift. If two siblings fought, the matter was brought to the family council, which usually included at least 3 elders and 1 cousin, who always took things personally. Punishments range from being assigned extra chores to a dramatic lecture in front of the neighbours. In some rare cases, misbehaving family members were temporarily banished to sleep in the grain room. No one liked the grain room. It was full of beetles and unfinished conversations. Children were treasured, but also expected to behave like miniature adults. They worked early, learned fast, married young. Parents showed love by teaching them to survive. A mother might wake her child at dawn to teach them to identify healing herbs or calculate weights with uneven stones. A father might spend a week showing his son how to carve a signature seal. These were acts of legacy, not just skill. Love wasn't soft, it was sturdy. You sit near a low bench where a young woman is teaching her niece to weave. Her instructions are gentle, her corrections are firm. She pauses to tell a story about their grandmother, who once chased a thief out of the village with nothing but a broken broom and a terrifying stare. The girl laughs. She knots the next row tighter. Generational love is built like that, one memory at a time. Household gods played a role in family bonds too. Small altars were kept in the home with figures of protective spirits. Offerings were made. Prayers were said. If a family member was travelling or ill, the gods were consulted for guidance. In one case, a family offered a chicken and a comb to their household deity in exchange for the safe return of a nephew who had eloped with a fish seller. He returned, married, slightly damp. The gods were thanked with extra incense and a very passive-aggressive song. Inheritance laws preserved the family unit. Property passed through male heirs, but daughters often received dowries, jewellery or land as part of their marriage. If a father died without a will, disputes erupted like barley in wet season. There are court records of family members trying to prove legitimacy, using everything from old tablets to birthmarks shaped like temple animals. You head back toward the courtyard as dinner is served. Flatbread, lentils, and a sticky fruit paste arranged on mismatched plates. Everyone eats together. Arguments are paused. A toddler dumps food on a cat. An uncle starts humming. The broom returns. It taps against the floor with authority. The toddler stops. The cat does not. As night falls, the house does not grow quiet. It changes shape. People shift mats, untie sandals, wrap children in blankets. A woman tells her son to stop pretending to be a statue. He freezes more dramatically. His sister laughs. His father pretends not to see. This is family in Mesopotamia. Tangled, structured, affectionate, exhausting. And just as you think the day is done, someone opens a jar of wedding invitations. The wedding jar is open with a loud pop. Someone cheers, someone else groans. A third person immediately begins debating whether the dried figs inside are still fresh enough to serve without boiling. The answer is no. They will be boiled anyway. You're now inside the chaotic countdown to a Mesopotamian wedding. Not a quiet ceremony. Not a soft exchange of vows beneath the stars. This is a full-blown, legally sanctioned, multi-day eruption of rituals, recipes, contractual obligations, and dance moves that were never meant for human ankles. A boy runs past holding 3 strings of garlic, a painted gourd, and a chicken that does not want to be involved. A woman follows with a basket of ceremonial loaves stamped with fertility symbols. The floor is already coated in flour. The priest has not even arrived. Mesopotamian weddings were structured around legal precedent, divine blessing, and an alarming amount of barley. The actual union began long before the feast, usually with a negotiation between families. Once the dowry was agreed upon, and the couple's compatibility confirmed through omens, dreams, and maybe one awkward conversation supervised by 4 elders, the preparations began. You pass the scribe's table where the marriage contract is being written. It includes terms for property ownership, expected children, ritual obligations, and what should happen if one party tries to flee the household disguised as a travelling pot merchant. That specific clause is based on precedent. The groom's cousin tried it last year. He's still not allowed at weddings. A cousin is grinding spice into a bowl while explaining to a teenager that love is not about feelings. It is about shared bread and someone else fixing the roof. A woman adds that feelings are helpful, but only if they do not interrupt dinner. Guests arrive carrying gifts, not romantic tokens, but practical items. Soap, ropes, cooking tools. One man delivers a full jar of fermented locust paste, which he insists is both a delicacy and a marital stimulant. The crowd pretends to believe him. The bride emerges from a side room wearing a veil woven with symbols of fertility, protection, and possibly moths. The veil is long, heavy, and smells faintly of cedar and nervous sweat. Her sandals are painted. Her hands are stained with henna and ritual oils. Her face is hidden. Her posture says she has memorized every step of this ceremony and will not hesitate to jab someone with a decorative reed if they deviate from the script. The groom appears next, escorted by male relatives and carrying a ceremonial staff topped with a lump of polished stone. He is sweating. His robe is stiff with starch and decorated with stitched birds. He smiles nervously. No one smiles back. It is not yet time to smile. They meet at the centre of the courtyard where a priest begins the recitation. It is long. It references every relevant god, recent lunar activity, the couple's family lines, and the proper agricultural metaphors for union. There is talk of soil and seed, of rivers joining, of baskets overflowing with grain. At one point the phrase, "her milk shall not spoil," is said aloud. Someone coughs. The priest continues. Now comes the oath. The couple drinks from a shared bowl of date wine and bites opposite ends of a ceremonial fig. If they finish without dropping it, the marriage is considered auspicious. If someone sneezes during this part, the ritual must be restarted. This is exactly what happens. The priest sighs and unwraps another fig. The moment the final prayer is uttered and the contract sealed with an official clay stamp, The shift begins. Ritual gives way to revelry. Music starts. Drums, flutes, finger cymbals played by children with no sense of rhythm or personal space. Someone begins shouting the names of famous lovers from myth. Someone else brings out a goat wearing bells. The feast begins with lentils, beer, and the ceremonial breaking of the barley cake. This is not symbolic, it is lunch. The couple is expected to feed each other while avoiding eye contact. The guests shout jokes, sing songs, and occasionally critique the bride's chewing form. It is all very affectionate. It is also very loud. You sit near an elderly woman who claims to have witnessed over 60 weddings. She remembers when dowries included jars of bees, and when grooms had to prove their worth by wrestling a ceremonial bull. Her favourite wedding included a fire, 3 broken clay tablets, and a guest who accidentally proposed to the wrong sibling. Children run between tables with baskets of dates and chunks of roasted meat. The groom's younger brother attempts to recite a poem and is drowned out by someone dropping a pot. The bride is gifted a set of carved spoons. The groom receives a basket of foot ointment and a slab of salt. These are considered deeply meaningful. Midway through the feast, the dancing begins. A group forms a circle. The music changes. The rhythm accelerates. Guests stomp, clap, shout, and occasionally fall over. One man attempts to balance a jug on his head. It lasts 3 seconds. The jug does not survive. A child begins spinning in circles until he collides with the ceremonial goat. The goat bleats. The crowd cheers. At the height of the celebration, the couple is led to a private room. Not for privacy, for ritual. Here they are, fed a final symbolic meal. Honey, bread, a raw egg cracked into a bowl and blessed with chants. They are told to listen to each other's breath, to speak one line of gratitude, to remove their sandals and place them together near the doorway. This marks the beginning of shared life. You walk through the courtyard again as the party spills into the night. Clay lanterns flicker. The food is mostly gone. The music has not stopped. An old man is singing about lost love and bad soup. A woman is dancing with a broom. 2 boys try to build a throne out of cushions and fail spectacularly. Marriage in Mesopotamia was not a private affair. It was a communal event, a legal pivot, a festival with consequences. It brought families together. It reset alliances. It created new lines of inheritance. And somewhere under all the noise, the rituals and the barley, it built a strange but lasting form of devotion. And now, with the wedding nearly done, someone mentions the bridal bed. The music fades into the background like a drunk uncle finally running out of verses. The guests slow their dancing. The final jug of beer is passed around like a sacred artifact. Someone tries to toast the goats. The goats do not respond. Across the courtyard, candles flicker low. Smoke drifts. Someone sneezes. The party is not over, but the transition is beginning. You follow the soft footsteps toward the edge of the house, where 2 woven mats have been laid side by side beneath a linen canopy, painted with moons, ears of grain, and what might be a stylized womb, or an incredibly optimistic melon. A group of women in long robes begin singing a chant so old it predates half the temples in the city. The bride is led toward the curtain. The groom follows, carrying a small jar of oil and looking like he's about to take an exam he didn't study for. This is not about love. This is about fertility. In ancient Mesopotamia, the bridal bed was both a symbol and a stage. It was not necessarily romantic, but it was crucial. This is where the union was confirmed. Legally, spiritually, physically. The gods had been invited. The ancestors had been invoked. Now it was time to prove that the couple could, and would, do what needed doing. You sit outside the curtain along with everyone else, pretending not to listen. The room is quiet. Too quiet. A priestess whispers a prayer. The groom's mother adjusts her sandals. One of the guests coughs into a bowl. On the far side of the courtyard, someone drops a platter. No one reacts. The rituals inside the canopy are not whispered legends. They are documented. Tablet after tablet outlines the expectations for this moment. There are scripts, orders, ingredients. In one preserved instruction, the couple is told to anoint each other with oil blessed by the goddess Ishtar, then wrap themselves in a woolen cloth that has been soaked in milk and dried under the full moon. This is believed to awaken the seed, soften the womb, and confuse nearby flies. A carved plaque from Ur shows a groom pouring oil onto his bride's hands while she offers him a date. The date is not to be eaten, it is to be held above the heart. Symbolism matters. If the fruit drops, it is a bad omen. If the fruit squishes, it is worse. If it is eaten, the priest must be summoned to restart the chant from the beginning. You listen as the priestess speaks through the curtain, instructing the couple to lie side by side, touch each other's foreheads, and breathe together as one. The rhythm must match. If it doesn't, they try again. Breath before body, spirit before flesh. You wonder how many newlyweds manage to get through this without laughing. In many homes, this first union was supervised, not visually, but spiritually and sometimes sonically. Priests or midwives might sit just outside, listening for the sounds of ritual success. If the silence lasted too long, someone might rattle a charm to encourage progress. If the noise became suspiciously enthusiastic, someone might rattle a charm anyway, just to remind them the gods were listening. One tablet from Nippur outlines a bridal ritual involving a symbolic yoke placed at the foot of the bed. This represents union and submission, depending on who you ask. Another document describes a bowl of cooked lentils placed beside the couple. If the lentils remain warm after the ceremony, it is a sign of future children. If they congeal too fast, it means someone lied during the engagement negotiations. You step aside as a woman walks by carrying a fresh sheet. It is plain white linen, woven by the bride's family, and meant to be placed beneath the couple during their first night. In some households, this sheet would later be shown to both families as proof of consummation, a practice both invasive and widely expected. Some brides, aware of this pressure, prepared additional linen stained with pomegranate juice, not for deception, but as insurance. Fertility was not assumed, it was demanded. A successful union was expected to produce children, preferably soon, preferably male. A newly married couple might receive fertility charms, fertility cakes, fertility oils, and very pointed questions from older relatives. If the bride did not become pregnant within a year, her family could face social questions. If 2 years passed, the contract might allow the husband to take a second wife or request a surrogate from within the household. Yes, that included servants, or in some cases a sister-in-law. The gods were deeply involved. Couples prayed to Ishtar, Inanna and Ninlil for successful conception. Offerings were made, songs were sung. At least one documented ritual involved circling the bed 3 times while chanting, "Let the seed fall like rain." Another involved rubbing the stomach with warm beer and humming. You pass a small altar outside the bedroom canopy, where a clay statue of a fertility goddess is flanked by 2 bowls. One holds milk, the other holds a small loaf shaped like a pair of feet. The symbolism is unclear. It may be a pun. Children born from these unions were not just offspring, they were legal entities. Inheritance depended on them. Family reputation depended on them. A man without children could lose his property to a nephew. A woman without children could lose her status in the household. In some cases, the couple could adopt, or they could petition the gods with more dramatic gestures. One tablet describes a couple sacrificing a pair of turtle doves and burying them beneath their bed. Another involves sleeping with a fish under the pillow for 3 nights. You glance back toward the bridal curtain. A soft bell rings. The priestess emerges. Her face is unreadable. She nods. The crowd exhales. It is done. Guests clap politely. Someone passes around more beer. The bride and groom remain behind the curtain for now. The groom's father begins singing a song about his own wedding. It contains too many references to goats. You leave the courtyard as the stars begin to fade behind the rooftops. The fire burns low. The ceremony is complete. But love in Mesopotamia does not end at the wedding bed. It begins as many strange Mesopotamian love affairs do, with a god demanding attention and a priesthood very willing to provide it. You're standing beneath the shadow of a ziggurat in the sweltering dust of Sumer. Incense smoulders from clay pots, mingling with the far less sacred stench of goat sweat and human armpits. It is the day of the Hieros Gamos, or sacred marriage, a ritual that promises divine fertility through one very awkward public performance. The temple courtyard is already packed, and in the centre sits a king looking impressively uncomfortable in a ceremonial loincloth. Across from him, the high priestess of Inanna stands with an expression that reads somewhere between serene mysticism and barely restrained eye roll. She represents the goddess of love and war, while he, the poor man with heat rash on his chest and a clay crown strapped to his scalp, is pretending to be the god Dumuzi. Together, they are about to engage in what the priests swear is a deeply spiritual reenactment of cosmic lovemaking. In reality, it's a performative snuggle in front of the public that somehow involves honey cakes, metaphorical poetry, and the overwhelming tension of two people who clearly did not rehearse. This ritual was not symbolic in the wink-wink kind of way. It was explicitly sexual, and it was one of the rare moments where love, religion, politics, and voyeurism all collided in broad daylight. The goal was to ensure the fertility of the land, and Mesopotamians believed that the copulation of their king and the goddess's stand-in could literally make the crops grow taller. Wheat production, apparently, was deeply invested in how well the king performed that evening. But this divine spectacle was just the tip of the scandalous ziggurat. You would also find a tradition of sacred prostitution embedded directly into the temple system. In the cult of Inanna or Ishtar, some women, and sometimes men, were expected to offer sexual rites as a form of devotion. It was a job, a spiritual calling, and an economic system all rolled into one sticky service. These temple attendants were known by various terms, from Ishtaritu to Kadishtu, and contrary to popular myth, not all were prostitutes. Some were musicians, midwives, or ritual specialists. Others, however, were indeed expected to sleep with strangers in exchange for offerings to the temple. There was no velvet curtain or red lamp to indicate what kind of service you were receiving. Instead, you might approach the temple with barley or silver, make your offering, and then wait until the god's chosen intermediary approached you. The lines between worship, economy, and pleasure were hopelessly entangled. And for many Mesopotamians, their first brush with romantic experience might come not from a blushing village girl behind the date stall, but from an encounter within the stone walls of a holy brothel. The cuneiform tablets we've found do not exactly contain Yelp reviews of the sacred experience, but they do suggest that temple lovers were praised in poetry and feared in private conversation. The power of a Kadishtu was not just sexual but spiritual. In some texts, their touch was said to bring ecstasy and transformation. In others, it was a pathway to madness or destruction. Much like Ishtar herself, whose romantic conquests tended to end in tragic dismemberment or sudden disappearances, temple lovers had a reputation for being both irresistible and dangerous. The economics of sacred love went beyond human pleasure. Temples in Mesopotamia were financial giants. They controlled land, managed trade, employed artisans, and taxed almost everything that moved. Love, then, became a state-sponsored industry. The price of intimacy was quite literally determined by the priests. In one tablet, the fee for a night of sacred company is set at 60 shekels of silver. In another, a broken seal reveals the name of a prostitute engraved into the ring, as if intimacy itself was an officially licensed commodity. And then there's the question of agency. Were temple lovers empowered spiritual workers or exploited labourers cloaked in divine rhetoric? The answer, frustratingly, is both. Some served willingly. Others were offered by their families as a form of debt repayment. In one chilling record, a young girl is dedicated to the goddess by her father, with no indication that she had much say in the matter. Religion, especially in its ancient corporate form, had a habit of making everything feel holy, even when it was transactional. Yet Mesopotamians saw no contradiction between sacredness and sensuality. For them, the union of bodies was a reflection of the union of heavens and earth. When a man lay with a temple woman, he was not just seeking pleasure. He was channeling cosmic forces, reenacting the mythic couplings of gods and goddesses, and allegedly helping the rivers stay full and the sheep remain fertile. All of this, mind you, while probably trying not to knock over a burning oil lamp mid-ritual. The rituals themselves were deeply formalized. Offerings were made, incantations were recited. In some cases, the lovers would be washed with perfumed water and dressed in ceremonial robes. The temple space might be covered in reeds, scented flowers, or symbolic items like carved pomegranates and sculpted figs. The act was watched over by other clergy, who would record the event and ensure that all divine protocol had been followed. And somewhere, beneath it all, was the belief that love was not just something you felt. It was something that had to be managed, supervised, and monetized by religious institutions with strong opinions about your pelvic alignment. This system blurred all the categories modern audiences cling to. It was not marriage. It was not prostitution. It was not theatre. It was all of those things, and none of them. It turned love into ceremony, affection into obligation, and the body into a tool for agricultural prosperity. But perhaps the strangest part was how this ritual was remembered. Kings would proudly carve their participation into stone. Poets would write hymns describing the sacred moaning of the goddess, and priests would draft ledgers tallying how many dates and jugs of beer had been received in honour of one particularly enthusiastic performance. In other words, ancient Mesopotamia turned the awkwardness of divine roleplay into a bureaucratic milestone. It is difficult to overstate how normalised this all was. For centuries, Mesopotamians lived with a deeply spiritualised sexuality that refused to hide behind closed doors. Instead, it strutted onto temple balconies, asked for payment in silver, and promised rain clouds in return. Their concept of love was as much about political symbolism and agricultural cycles as it was about romance. You were not just in love, you were part of an economy of desire, a citizen in a sacred feedback loop of passion and produce. And if you found yourself uncomfortably seated near the front row of a sacred marriage ceremony, fanning yourself with a palm leaf and pretending not to watch, you were still complicit in the system. You were a witness to one of history's most organised and least private attempts to seduce the gods into giving you better wheat. So now you're standing not on the temple steps but ankle deep in the domestic alleyways of urban Babylon, where hearts were not just broken but baked into permanent record. The scent of boiling fish and wet clay clings to everything. A goat screams somewhere in the distance. A child drops a loaf of barley bread onto the mud. But what really matters right now is the couple on the rooftop above you, because one of them has just made a truly terrible decision. They've sent a clay breakup letter. That's right. In ancient Mesopotamia, love wasn't just written in the stars. It was etched with a stylus into sun-dried clay, translated into cuneiform syllables so permanent that some still survive to this day. While most cultures opt for the quiet, tragic goodbye or the dramatic public argument, Mesopotamians preferred to record the entire ordeal in brittle rectangles of dirt and hand-deliver them through family members like emotionally loaded bricks. The content of these messages varied wildly. Some were tender, passive-aggressive sighs in written form. Others were the equivalent of shouting, "You never respected my uncle's grain silo," in legalese. And a few were detailed, multi-tablet tirades about adultery, bad in-laws, financial incompetence, or religious betrayal. It was less of a "Dear John," and more of a "By order of the goddess Inanna, I am hereby severing our emotional contract due to your chronic laziness and failure to provide adequate lentils." Relationships in Mesopotamia operated like miniature economies. You were expected to contribute to the household, honour your temple duties, produce offspring, and avoid publicly embarrassing your spouse during beer festivals. When that system broke down, the penalties could be harsh, and so the clay tablet became the nuclear option. Once written, dried, and sealed, it would often be delivered by a third party, sometimes a sibling, sometimes a hired messenger, occasionally a very confused sheep herder who happened to be passing through and was promised extra figs to act as courier. Breakups weren't just personal, they had administrative consequences. Property had to be divided, dowries were reclaimed, children were assigned new guardians, and all of this had to be recorded, witnessed, and approved by scribes who often took the liberty of embellishing the language for dramatic flair. You might be surprised to learn how many ancient scribes functioned less like notaries and more like passive-aggressive poets. In one surviving letter from the old Babylonian period, a woman accuses her ex of failing to fulfill his duties in the night, which may or may not refer to his performance in bed or his refusal to extinguish the oil lamp before sleep. Another clay tablet contains a man's complaint that his former partner has not respected the sacred goat of my household, a phrase historians have been desperately trying to interpret ever since. Some Mesopotamians didn't stop at breakups. They filed formal lawsuits over the end of a romance. In one rare but glorious case, a jilted woman filed a complaint that her former lover failed to deliver on his promise to sing songs before the gods in her honour. This was apparently a romantic tradition, a kind of musical offering where you praise your beloved's hips, while also reminding the divine pantheon that your family owns 3 oxen. When the performance never materialised, she took the matter straight to the local temple court. The law codes of the time supported many of these actions. Hammurabi's code, for instance, included specific clauses about what happens when one partner abandons another without cause. If a man left his wife but she had done no wrong, she was entitled to take his property and resume her life unbothered. If she had wronged him, however, the consequences could range from banishment to public shaming, to the very casual-sounding penalty of being drowned in the river. Marriage in Mesopotamia was not built on romantic whim. It was a contractual partnership, monitored by gods, regulated by priests, and occasionally ended with the precision of a well-phrased insult pressed into terracotta. You didn't just ghost someone, you filed them under regrettable domestic error and handed them a slab of baked regret. Divorce was especially tricky when fertility was involved. If a couple had no children after several years, the pressure began to mount. Often, a man could legally take a second wife or concubine without divorcing the first. This led to some of the most passive-aggressive multi-wife correspondence in the ancient world. Imagine being wife number 1, reading a tablet from your husband announcing he's taken wife number 2, and she's already moved into the room that used to hold your ceremonial incense bowls. To deal with this, some women wrote their own counter tablets. These included emotional appeals to the gods, lists of grievances, or long, beautifully structured complaints about how the new wife sings off-key during rituals and uses too much oil in the lentil stew. In many ways, these tablets are the world's earliest burn letters, composed in fury, sealed in clay, buried in household archives for archaeologists to find several millennia later and mutter things like yikes in academic journals. But not all breakups were messy. Some were deeply formal. A couple would stand before a priest, recite the necessary dissolution phrases, and split their belongings like accountants during a famine. This version of love's end was still sad, but at least it didn't involve anyone throwing an amphora or hiding the family rooster out of spite. The most surreal part: these breakups were preserved with the same care as religious hymns and royal decrees. Future generations might stumble upon a political treaty between city-states stored in the same archive room as one man's angry tirade about how his former lover kept leaving the household door open during sandstorms. Mesopotamians believed in permanence. They believed the written word had power, and so, when they fell in love, or out of it, they did not whisper their emotions into the wind. They carved them into the bones of the earth, stacking broken relationships like geological strata for future humans to marvel at. Even the tools of love and heartbreak became standardized. A stylus, usually made of reed, allowed for precise cuneiform strokes. Clay was gathered from riverbanks, shaped into palm-sized slabs, and dried in the sun, or baked in a kiln for added permanence. It was entirely possible that your angry ex not only delivered a tablet to you, but also archived a second copy in their family's private library, just in case you ever tried to deny that they told you to go kiss your cousin's goat and never return. And so the rooftops of Mesopotamia echoed with more than prayers and song. They carried the silence of shattered unions, the whisper of styluses scratching complaints, and the brittle laughter of future generations reading about arguments over burnt fish and forgotten oil rations. Love, in the ancient world, was as bureaucratic as it was passionate, and nothing says romantic closure quite like a museum full of break-up tablets, recovered from a crumbling brick oven. Some people follow their hearts, some follow their guts. In Mesopotamia, they followed someone else's goat liver. Because when it came to matters of love, nothing said destiny quite like the quivering left lobe of a freshly sacrificed animal. You might have thought astrology was invented for personality quizzes, but the Mesopotamians weaponized it for matchmaking, birth control, marriage arbitration, and yes, even determining whether your crush would one day murder you in your sleep. You're now seated on a low brick bench inside a temple, watching a priest prepare to slice open the abdominal cavity of an absolutely enormous sheep. A bronze tray is ready beside him, polished and engraved with little compartments labelled with symbols representing cosmic zones of divine influence. This is not a casual event. This is love divination, and your entire romantic future is about to be read from the pancreas of a confused herbivore. This ritual was called extispacy. In short, the practice of divining the will of the gods through the dissection and examination of internal organs, especially livers. The liver was considered the seat of the soul, the central processing unit of fate. Its surface, with all its bizarre lobes, bumps and fissures, was believed to be a message board sent straight from the gods. And if you were a nervous young Sumerian wondering whether to marry the basket weaver next door, this was how you got your answer. First, you'd need a trained diviner, not just any priest. This one wore elaborate robes and had memorized hundreds of omen combinations. He'd ask a very specific yes or no question on your behalf. Something like, if this man weds the daughter of Kikatu the potter, will his family line survive for 4 generations? Or perhaps, will marrying the baker's niece result in divine wrath, war, or unusually sour barley beer? The question would be formalized, the goat sacrificed, and the liver carefully lifted for inspection. Then the fun began. The priest would lean in, eyebrows furrowed, and examine the organ's texture, shape, and abnormalities. If the right lobe bulged too far, it meant jealousy. If a fissure ran through the centre, it meant a betrayal in the 3rd month of marriage. A dark spot might indicate infertility. A pale liver warned of disease or divine disapproval. It was astrology with meat, palm reading with intestines, and it was taken very, very seriously. In some cities, royal marriages were determined this way. A king would consult his liver priest before agreeing to a politically convenient wedding. If the liver said no, the alliance was cancelled, regardless of how many cows had already been exchanged. This could ruin trade deals and spark minor wars. But to proceed without the gods' approval was unthinkable. You might survive a military defeat, but not a liver-based omen gone wrong. And it wasn't just the liver. Other organs could chime in too. The lungs were consulted for breath of life, the kidneys for emotional resilience, the gallbladder for anger. There were even entire clay models made to record organ shapes and their corresponding predictions. Archaeologists have found tablets with diagrams of sheep livers annotated with phrases like sign of loss, favourable for love, or beware the house of the south wind. The south wind was apparently a romantic menace, but not all romantic predictions were animal-based. The stars themselves offered clues. Mesopotamians were among the first astronomers in history. They charted Venus cycles, lunar eclipses, and planetary alignments with terrifying precision. A full moon during the 3rd hour of night might mean your lover was faithful. A comet in the east spelled doom for anyone who had recently kissed someone from the Carpenters Guild. One Babylonian tablet spells out what appears to be a proto-dating manual based entirely on celestial movement. If Mars rises before Venus, the woman will bring strife. If Jupiter stands in Leo, The man will be generous but weak. It's as if your dating app consulted NASA before showing you a match. Swipe left if Saturn is in retrograde. Swipe right if the liver looked glossy. This fusion of astronomy and love led to some absurd behaviours. Parents might delay their daughter's wedding until a certain star appeared. A young man might cancel an engagement because a diviner told him his horoscope aligned with the destructive power of the god Nergal. Some people became so obsessed with checking signs that they consulted omens before every romantic interaction. Imagine needing divine permission to flirt. Or worse, imagine being told your relationship failed because Venus appeared too close to the tail of a lion constellation during planting season. And yet, even amid all this superstition, Mesopotamian lovers still found ways to outwit the gods. Some began bribing liver diviners, others faked liver anomalies. There are texts describing priests who would discreetly swap a suspicious organ with a more favourable one if the client was persuasive enough. This led to widespread divine confusion and several very unamused gods. As with everything in Mesopotamia, the rituals of romantic prediction eventually made their way into legal code. Marriages without omen consultation were considered legally weaker. Divorce cases occasionally cited bad omens ignored as part of the blame. He should have known, one clay tablet reads, for the moon rose thrice and did not bow, which might mean the man ignored a triple lunar warning and married someone cursed with loud chewing. Perhaps the most absurd example of omen-driven romance comes from a set of fragmentary texts found near Uruk. They describe a couple who repeatedly delayed their wedding because every time they scheduled it, a new bad omen appeared. A storm cloud shaped like a serpent, a pigeon that flew in the wrong direction, a sneeze from a temple guard. The couple delayed for 9 years before finally marrying under what they declared a neutral sky. Their tablet ends with the hopeful phrase, "The gods did not scream." It is perhaps the Mesopotamian version of "we did our best." This obsession with signs, entrails and stars reveals something deeply human, the desire to control chaos, to find meaning in the madness of love. Because while hearts can deceive and hormones can betray, the liver was honest. It was there, laid bare, pulsing with cosmic instruction, and if it told you to marry the onion merchant's third son, you did it. Unless the moon changed its mind again tomorrow. If you enjoyed tonight's deep dive into historical dating disasters, let me know in the comments what weird corner of history you want me to suffer through next. I am more than willing to lose sleep so you can. And hey, if slow, absurd historical suffering is your thing, check out my other videos. They're full of lice, leeches, and life decisions worse than your ex's. Sleep tight.